All right, well, now looking at my body paragraphs, I can already tell that with this one, I might actually have enough for 2 body paragraphs. I can talk about the availability of food because I have multiple sources, and then I can also talk about the environmental impact in a separate one. So I'm going to start with the availability food. So one key issue, the availability of these local foods, introducing what I'm going to talk about, must be considered if a community hopes to implement a locavore movement. And then I want to introduce where I live. This is a good opportunity anytime you're talking about like a personal example or an example you're bringing in to bring in some voice. So I'm going to kind of try to add some details. Consider where I live. North Dakota, thick layers of snow and incredibly low temperatures are common for most of the year. This makes the growing of produce or any crop for that matter impossible. So I want to say now I'm going to do my analysis where I want to kind of express how it's not practical to do locavorism when obviously we don't have the local food. So I guess I'll probably just say that. So without local food, how can a community such as my own even consider locavorism? Similarly, there are many urban areas in our country that make locavorism infeasible. Well, they're not the ones. So I'm going to rephrase that because it sounds like the urban areas are making it infeasible. But they're, okay. In our country, in which locavorism is impractical. Just to switch up my words a little bit. And then that was from source F, so I'm going to go back and pull something here. Looking down here, I see this percentage, which is pretty significant. So I will say that down here. 80% of Americans live in areas without farmland or even live in areas without farmland or outside the 100-mile radius suggested by some locavores. Oops, I forgot. I'm going to put my source F there. I like this piece of evidence because it's specific. 80 is a pretty substantial number. Now I'm going to explain that. For this vast majority, I'm going to change my language to eating local, is similarly not an option. And I'm saying similarly because I'm referring to myself in North Dakota. Recognizing, so now I'm going to connect back to my topic sentence, which is the key issue. Recognizing that the availability of local food is the primary issue in how practicable locavorism is, communities like my own and those of urban areas will find the diet infeasible. So here, oops, do that every time. Infeasible. I've connected back to my claim by using the word infeasible, but I've also talked about, I use the word issue to talk back that I'm talking about that key issue. Okay, my next paragraph, then I'm going to talk about the other key issue, which, as my outline says, is the environmental impact. Another issue that is often misinterpreted in regards to this movement is environmental impact. I'm going to do a they say. Many proponents of this diet argue that buying only local produce is good for the environment. And I want to get that source in there, so I'm going to refer to source A quick. And it says, that organic food essentially creates less environmental damage right there. So I'm going to add that. So many proponents of this diet argue that buying organic food creates less, and then I'm going to use the exact same language from the source so that it's a paraphrase, less environmental damage. I want to use that exact phrase so they know what I'm referring to. So many proponents of this diet argue that buying only organic food creates less environmental damage. That's from source A. Then I need my switch word. However, this information is skewed. In fact, and then my information was C or D, and that's where we talk about the transportation, right? The 15% carbon footprint. I think I'm going to use this source later for this, but I do want to talk about the economies of scale. So maybe I can talk about the economies of scale with this chart so I can get a good example of that source talk we've talked about. So I will say that, in fact, I'm going to revise my last sentence, actually. However, this information is skewed to ignore economic scale. And then that's what source C says. So then I'm going to kind of paraphrase this example instead of writing out the 2,000 miles, 2,000 apples, 50 miles. Let's do this here. However, this information is skewed to ignore economic scale. For instance, a large food distributor will transport a greater number of items, such as apples, I'm getting that detail from the source, the same distance as a small farmer. That was from source C. And I'm going to explain that. So in other words, large production moves more product, but the distance stays the same. This creates imbalance, as a small farmer would travel more frequently to sell less. I'm going to go back and reread this because I think I'm getting a little off task. For instance, a large food distributor will transport a greater number of items, such as apples, the same distance as a small farmer. In other words, large corporations move more product, but the distance stays the same. This creates imbalance as a small farmer would travel more frequently. Yeah, this sentence is kind of, I think, this says it. In other words, large corporations move more product, but the distance stays the same, and therefore, so does the carbon footprint, right? Furthermore, now I'm going to use that chart. Furthermore, this transportation of goods is responsible for only a small portion of food's carbon imprint. imprint. So now I'm going to refer to the chart. I want to see who made the chart quick. Conservation Magazine. I'm getting that up here from the source information. So Conservation Magazine, which if I was doing this in a written one, I'd want that underlined. Conservation Magazine. I'm going to say what that is. An environmental publication. I don't want to say magazine again. Published. I don't want to say published again. Compiled data in a chart which shows that only a small portion of food's carbon imprint is the result of transportation. And that was source D. You could have obviously used the source C information again here, but I wanted to use source D because the more sources I can kind of get working together, I think the richer it sounds, but it would have been just as good to talk about source C and the information, that 11% that's presented in there. Okay. From these different aspects, oops, I don't even know what I'm saying. So I want to kind of analyze what that means. And essentially, while those who support locavorism argue that it is better for the environment, a key issue for communities considering the same is that this information is often inaccurate or or inaccurate or incomplete. Therefore, so I've connected back to my key issue, but now I want to talk about the infeasibility. Ultimately, the practice's feasibility lessens due to I wonder, you know what, I'm actually going to not have a conclusion sentence here. I mean, I have this, which connects back to my key issues, but ultimately that is connecting back to my task, because I remember in my claim I said the key issues, so I'm actually just going to leave that and move on to my next paragraph.